Spooky season is almost upon us, so it's time for a new series. I had so much fun learning about the ghosts of Crater Lake that I decided it was a good time of year to do spooky national park stories. First up is Yellowstone. People have lived in the area for over 11,000 years, and the national park was established in 1872. It's not hard to see how its long history, combined with the sulfury, steamy landscape, has led to spooky stories springing up over the years. One of Yellowstone's most famous ghosts is the Headless Bride. Our story begins in New York in 1915, where an heiress marries a servant in her father's household. Her father, unhappy with her choice, gives her and her new husband a significant amount of money to leave town forever. The two take the money and head to Yellowstone for their honeymoon, where they stay at the Old Faithful Inn. As you might expect, things do not go well. Her husband drinks and gambles away all of her dowry, and one night the staff hear them arguing, followed by the husband storming off, never to be seen again. 2 days later, an unlucky maid finds the bride's headless body in a bathtub. After a few more days, her head is found in the crow's nest, an elevated platform in the lobby where a band would sometimes set up to play. Since then, guests and staff have reported seeing a ghostly form in a white dress descending from the crow's nest with their head tucked under their arm. Sound too good to be true? Well, you might be right. According to George Borneman, a former bell captain at the inn, he made it all up when a reporter wouldn't stop badgering him about ghost stories. However, Borneman does claim that he heard phantom footsteps running along the hallways of the inn, and that these were what helped inspire him to come up with this story. It also hasn't stopped guests from still claiming to see the Headless Bride from time to time. So, which park should I do next? I'm coming back to Yellowstone for my next spooky national park story because I just learned about the strangest phenomenon that occurs there. Let's talk about the fact that Yellowstone Lake mysteriously hums and nobody knows why. There are accounts dating back to at least 1872 of strange sounds coming from Yellowstone Lake. People have described the sound in a variety of ways, from metal cables crashing together to ethereal organ music, or even a strange whistling or buzzing noise. Some even liken it to a strange whomping noise or even the calls of whales. Despite being one of the busiest and most well-studied parks in the United States, though, no one knows where these sounds originate. Theories include the combination of specific wind and weather conditions echoing off the surrounding mountain ridges, the amplification of extremely low-frequency waves due to magma movement below, or even connections to small earthquakes or hydrothermal vents beneath the lake. More recently, the sounds have only been heard in the winter, suggesting the movement and vibration of ice could play a role. Park ranger Christine Brunsman says she likes to imagine there's a mystical creature that lives in the depths of Yellowstone Lake, calling out a lonely song, its roars echoing in isolation. What do you think? It's time for more spooky national parks, and this time we're doing Zion. Zion National Park in Utah has some stories of ghosts, but also many gruesome stories of accidental deaths. Hikers in the park often report seeing lights flickering in the distance in places where there should be no other people. Although I would guess they're actually seeing the lanterns of rock climbers up on cliff faces. Folklore exists about two prominent rock formations in the park, the Watchman and the North Guardian Angel. Supposedly they serve as beacons for the dead, helping to guide their spirits back to our world. The spot that has seen the most deaths of tourists is the falls along the Emerald Pools Trail. The famous Angel's Landing is also one of the most dangerous public hikes in the United States. Many people over the years have slipped and fell to their death trying to get a better look or take a good picture. Public Information Officer for the park, John Marciano, said that a deer that fell 800 feet to its death in spring 2021 basically exploded, so you can only imagine what might happen to a human body. Just outside the national park, you can visit the Grafton Ghost Town. The town was founded in 1859, moved in 1862 due to flooding, and almost completely abandoned by 1906. Within that relatively short time period, as many as 84 people were buried in the cemetery, with 13 deaths occurring in 1866 alone. Today, it is said to be one of the most photographed ghost towns in the country and was made famous by movies like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Visitors report feeling uneasy both in buildings and when walking amongst the graves in the cemetery. They're said to hear phantom footsteps, feel cold breezes, and see shadow figures. There have been sightings of ghost children that reportedly died in accidents, as well as the ghost of a pioneer woman who wanders through the cemetery crying and vanishes when people approach her. Supposedly, the Grafton Heritage Partnership Program was recently looking for a caretaker to live there full time. So if creepy abandoned towns are your thing, you should check it out. Keep the park suggestions coming, and happy spooky season! Our next spooky park is Glacier National Park in Montana. The most terrifying story from Glacier has nothing to do with ghosts or monsters, but is actually a cautionary tale about proper wildlife management in our national parks. In the first 57 years that Glacier was operating as a national park, 0 people were killed by grizzly bears. In that time, though, the park had become a ticking time bomb for a fatal bear attack. It was 1967, and the Granite Park Chalet, a backcountry guest house along the popular Highline Trail, had been dumping their food scraps in a ravine so guests could watch bears enjoying the feast each evening. This meant that the bears now associated people with food rather than having a natural fear of them. And early in the morning of August 13th, 2 young women would pay the price. Just after midnight, 19-year-old Julie Helgeson, who was sleeping in the campground below the chalet, was dragged from her sleeping bag by a bear that had just gotten done gnawing at her friend Roy Duckett's arms and legs. For context, an adult grizzly bear has a bite force strong enough to crush a bowling ball. By the time rescuers found her downhill hours later, just after 4 a.m., she had lost an enormous amount of blood and ended up dying shortly after being brought to the chalet. Around 4:30 a.m. that same morning, a different grizzly attacked 19-year-old Michelle Coons, who was camped at nearby Trout Lake. Her companions escaped, but she couldn't get her sleeping bag unzipped and was carried off by the bear. They heard her cry, "He's got my arm off," and then, "Oh God, I'm dead." She would be found later that morning, having died from her injuries. Within 24 hours, the bears responsible were shot and killed. Some feared that the backlash from these attacks would lead to the complete eradication of bears from our national parks. However, what actually happened was a reshaping of our approach to bear management, with parks enacting strict regulations, especially with respect to garbage disposal practices and food storage, to protect both visitors and the bears. If you want a more detailed account of this, the 1969 book Night of the Grizzlies is excellent. Another spooky park story is coming tomorrow. Isle Royale National Park is a perfect choice to talk about for spooky season. It's an isolated island in northern Lake Superior that's accessible only by boat or float plane. There are moose on the island as well as a wolf pack, and people have been visiting for at least 6,500 years. Lake Superior is notoriously dangerous, and there are several well-preserved shipwrecks you can visit around the island. There have also been sightings of ghost ships over the years. There's even an outpost on the island that used to be the home to the headquarters of the mining company. One of the most popular spooky stories people tell about Isle Royale, though, is that of Angelique Mott and her husband Charlie. Angelique was a 17-year-old Anishinaabe woman, and Charlie was a French-Canadian voyageur. The two were dropped off on Isle Royale in July of 1845 to scout for copper ore, and after finding a large mass of it, were charged with guarding it until a barge could be brought back to carry the copper back to the mainland. They were promised a ship would return within 3 months, but one wouldn't arrive until the following spring. The couple was left with minimal supplies, lost their canoe in a late summer storm, and had their fishing net destroyed. By January, Charlie was mad with hunger and fever and threatened to murder and eat Angelique. He went so far as to start sharpening a butcher knife in front of her, but she was able to take the knife from him, and he would eventually die of starvation. Unable to bury the body in the frozen ground, Angelique was forced to leave their small cabin and build a hut for herself to live in. She would survive by eating poplar bark, berries, and even catching small animals with snares made out of her own hair, and was rescued in May of 1846. Today, some claim to see the ghost of Charlie Mott still wander in the woods, desperately looking for food. Great Smoky Mountains National Park used to be home to one of the scariest monsters of legend. Utlunta, which translates to Spearfinger, was a shape-shifting witch of Cherokee legend. It's said she had skin as hard as stone, a mouth stained with the blood of her victims, and a spear or knife-like finger on her right hand. Within the palm of that same hand, she kept her heart hidden. She traveled through the woods with a raven companion, shrieking, cackling, and singing an eerie song about eating livers. Some also say that because of her stone-like skin, a sound like rolling thunder could be heard when she walked. She would often take the form of a familiar old woman in order to lure children to her. Then she would use her sharp finger to stab her victims through the back of their neck or heart to steal their liver. Her attacks were so stealthy the victims didn't even realize what had happened until they began to weaken and eventually die a few days later without their liver. Eventually, a group of Cherokees set a trap for her and killed her by severing her heart from her hand. But she wasn't the only one out there eating livers. Her enemy, Stone Man, who was also fond of the organ, took her death as a warning, but soon went back to his old ways. Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky is home to the world's longest known cave system. It's also apparently considered one of the world's most haunted natural wonders, with one source stating there have been at least 150 documented paranormal encounters there. The cave has a long history of visitation by humans. Native Americans began exploring it around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, leaving behind artifacts and petroglyphs. During the War of 1812, the cave was a source of saltpeter, which is used to manufacture gunpowder. Guided tours of the cave began as early as 1816. In 1839, Dr. John Croghan purchased the property for $10,000. In 1842, Croghan began an experiment where he invited 16 tuberculosis sufferers to live in the cave, believing the temperature and humidity would help to heal them. Tragically, living in the dank, dark cave had the opposite effect. Patients' symptoms worsened. A server responsible for bringing in meals said they looked like a company of skeletons. 5 of them would die in the cave in the 5 months the experiment was run. Their bodies were laid out on what is now known as Corpse Rock until they could be removed. Some say you can still hear coughing in that section of the cave. The tuberculosis patients aren't the only ghosts, though. By the middle of the 19th century, Mammoth Cave had become popular with tourists. One of the most popular tour guides was a slave named Stephen Bishop. He was buried near the cave in the Old Guide Cemetery after he died in 1859. Today, he's become one of the cave's most famous ghosts. During modern tours, park rangers and tourists alike have reported being playfully shoved or grabbed by an unseen force, heard footsteps, and have seen an apparition of Bishop tagging along with tour groups. Who's ready to go spelunking? Established in 1890, Yosemite has the distinction of being one of the oldest national parks in the United States. And it comes with some really spooky stories that stretch back to before the national park was even established. Galen Clark, who's considered by many to be the first park ranger, was on a hike in September of 1857. As he came to Grouse Lake, he heard a distinct wailing cry, somewhat like a puppy when lost. He moved on, dismissing the sound as either a dog or some wild animal, but that evening, after making camp with a group of Native Americans, he asked them about what he had heard. In Galen's words, here's what they told him. They replied that it was not a dog, that a long time ago a boy had been drowned in the lake, and that every time anyone passed there, he always cried after them, and no one dared go into the lake, for the boy would catch them by the legs and pull them down, and they would be drowned. The most haunted spot at Yosemite is reportedly the Ahwahnee Hotel, although the ghosts there are harmless. Former hotel developer Mary Curry Tressiter died on the 6th floor in her apartment in 1970. She's still seen roaming the halls by staff and guests alike. She's said to tuck people into bed or fold their clothes for them. The hotel also hosts a haunted rocking chair that's associated with JFK staying there in 1962. Reportedly, he requested a rocking chair for his room on the 3rd floor. The chair was removed, but guests and maids have reported still seeing a rocking chair there moving on its own. I guess you could say the ghosts there really rock. A lot of people asked for Rocky Mountain National Park, so here we go. I didn't just want to do the Stanley, so it took some searching, but what I found is a cryptid I've never heard of before, and I absolutely love. According to lumberjacks and miners from the 19th century, the slide rock bolter lives in the Rocky Mountains and likes to eat tourists. This whale-like monster makes its home on the steepest mountain slopes, specifically ones that are greater than 45 degrees. It waits with its tail hooked around the mountaintop for days at a time. Upon sighting a tourist, the slide rock bolter releases its hold and slides down the mountain slip-and-slide style, using its greasy drool as a lubricant and gobbling up the unsuspecting person below plus anything else in its path. Legend has it that a forest ranger destroyed one of these creatures by luring it with a dummy filled with dynamite and blasting caps. I'm not sure what prompted lumberjacks and miners to create this elaborate piece of folklore to explain simple things like rock slides and avalanches, but it is so great. More spooky parks are on the way. Abandoned homes and ghost towns are inherently creepy, but Shenandoah National Park takes it to another level. There are several locations where you can hike through the remnants of small mountain communities that were displaced by the establishment of the park. The people who built and lived in these settlements as far back as the 1770s were largely cut off from society. I'd also be remiss not to mention that Native Americans occupied the land as far back as 9,000 years ago. Nowadays, what's left are stone foundations and crumbling chimneys as the buildings are slowly reclaimed by the forest. There are also over 100 small cemeteries located within the park. One of the buildings still left standing is the Corbin Cabin. It was built in the early 20th century by George Corbin, and it's said his wife Nee died there during childbirth in 1924. The cabin and property, including the family cemetery, was passed to the government when Shenandoah National Park was established in 1935. Backpackers who rent out the cabin claim to still hear Nee Corbin walking through it and wandering through the nearby woods. Paranormal activity has also been reported at Far Pocosin, now known as Pocosin Mission. This was a religious outpost established around 1902 to 1905. The mission buildings are in ruins, but you can still see the concrete steps that led to the church and parts of its foundation and chimney. Both of these locations can be reached by fairly easy hikes, so I think you should go hunt down some ghosts. Olympic National Park's spooky side is best known by its association with everyone's favorite cryptid, Bigfoot. The park's lush, old-growth forest and mild, rainy climate seem like the perfect place for a hidden hominid to hang out. People have reported Sasquatch sightings in and around the park for decades. Sometimes an encounter is just a quick drive-by in a car, but people tell of vocalizations, knocking sounds, and even Bigfoot throwing stones. A story from the Kilauea tribe tells of a Bigfoot encounter by a tribe member named Boston Charlie. He was injured on one of his many trips into the Olympic Mountains and feared he would die, but he claimed a huge hairy being brought him berries. Because of this, he was able to survive the ordeal, but he never went back into the mountains again. One of your best chances of encountering Sasquatch is said to be along the Hoh River Trail. I'm inclined to think Bigfoot encounters are almost always misidentifications of black bears and other large mammals, but you can contribute by reporting any sightings to the Bigfoot Field Research Organization or by joining in on an expedition led by the Olympic Project. Of course, you should also keep an eye out for sparkly vampires and shape-shifting wolves. It gets worse. Olympic National Park is not just home to Bigfoot. There's also some really creepy legends and ghost stories, particularly those associated with Lake Crescent. The native Kilauea and Quileute people claim that long ago, members of both tribes were killed when Mount Storm King grew angry at their fighting and crushed them with a huge boulder thrown from its summit. This is one of those instances that I love where folklore lines up with science. Geologists have found evidence for a massive landslide that occurred 8,000 years ago. This landslide created a dam and cut the pre-existing lake into two parts, creating what we now know as Lake Crescent and Lake Sutherland. Lake Crescent is special because it is particularly clear and very cold, so bodies don't decay like they normally would in water. In 1940, two fishermen reeled in the nearly perfectly preserved corpse of Hallie Illingworth, who had been missing for 3 years. Because of the lake's unique conditions and chemistry, her skin and soft tissue had been converted into a soap-like substance called adipocere, also known as corpse wax, and she still had a ring of purple bruises around her neck. She's now known as the Lady of the Lake, and people claim to still see her gliding across its surface. Hallie isn't the only missing person associated with Lake Crescent. More recently, in 2002, a 1927 Chevy was discovered that belonged to a couple who had been missing since 1929, finally solving the mystery of their death. Then, in 2013, serial killer Israel Keys claimed to have dumped at least one of his victims in the lake. It's thought that there's an underground stream that flows from Lake Crescent into Lake Sutherland. Dr. Charles P. Larson, a pathologist from Tacoma who worked on Hallie's body back in 1940, estimated that you would probably find 50 to 100 bodies stuck in that channel, all turned to soap. This one is not a national park, but it absolutely deserves a Spooky Parks feature. It may not look like much today, but 1,000 years ago, Cahokia Mound State Historic Site was home to a sophisticated city. It is the largest known pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. At its peak, around 1050 to 1150 AD, Cahokia had a population of about 10,000 to 20,000 people, and about 50,000 in the greater Cahokia area. No one knows for sure why this once thriving city was abandoned. Recent evidence, including the analysis of ancient poop samples, suggests that shifts in climate and long-lived drought may have played a role. The people of Cahokia were mound builders. The mounds were large earthen structures that served a variety of purposes. They could be everything from burial sites to platforms for buildings or ritual practices. There are about 190 mounds in total. Monk's Mound covers an area of 15 acres and is 100 feet high, making it the largest earthen indigenous structure north of Mexico. Over 50 years ago, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave beneath one of the mounds, simply known as Mound 72. That grave contained 53 skeletons. They continued their excavation and found 24 burial pits and 270 bodies in total. Many of the bodies, which include women and children, show evidence that they were killed by violent means. Some may even have been buried alive, as the position of their fingers suggests that they were trying to dig their way out. New River Gorge in West Virginia is America's newest national park. It was officially established on December 27, 2020, so let's celebrate by talking about what makes it spooky. Like Shenandoah, I think New River Gorge's spooky side is best exemplified by what was left behind by people who used to live in the area. Within the park, Red Ash Island sits across the river from the abandoned mining town of Red Ash. In happier times, the island was used for recreation by the citizens of Red Ash. However, some have now taken to calling it the Island of the Dead given the darker parts of its history. A humble cemetery can be found there. Most of the gravestones are just simple field stones, and many other graves are unmarked entirely. Within them are victims of multiple tragedies associated with the mining town. In the 1890s, a smallpox epidemic hit Red Ash, and the island was used as a quarantine camp for the infected. Those who died were buried there. There were also 2 deadly mine disasters from explosions that occurred in 1900 and then again in 1905. Combined, they killed 70 people. Of course, then came the 1918 flu pandemic. The mine closed down in the 1930s, and by the 1950s, the town of Red Ash was abandoned. The cemetery has been left to be reclaimed by the forest, largely unnoticed by the thousands of rafters that float by on the river each year. With more people visiting now that it's a national park, I bet we'll soon be hearing about spirit encounters in this and other ghost towns along the New River. Sounds like a good time to plan a spooky rafting trip. Big Bend National Park was established in 1944 and is actually one of the least visited parks in the United States. That doesn't mean it lacks for spooky stories, though. Stories of ghosts and other creepy mysteries stretch back hundreds, if not thousands of years. In the Canyon de Brujas, or Witches Canyon, people claim to hear moaning sounds coming from the water. It's said that a young Apache woman chose a drowning death there rather than risk capture from bandits who were chasing her down. I think my favorite ghost story from Big Bend is that there is a ghost bull that's thought to be a harbinger of death. In 1891, two cowboys named Fine Gilliland and Henry Powell were fighting over a brandless bull. Both ended up dying, Powell in a gunfight between them, and Gilliland when a Texas Ranger caught up with him later. Afterwards, the bull was branded with the word murder and is said to still roam the park. Other spooky stories from Big Bend come from above. The park is a designated dark sky park, meaning that it has some of the best stargazing in the world. The town of Marfa and its famous lights lie not too far north of the park. Similar phantom lights have also been seen in Big Bend. The glowing balls have been attributed to everything from swamp gas to reflections of car headlights to an optical illusion to UFOs to ghosts and are visible all year round. They've been seen since at least the late 19th century, but likely for much longer, as indigenous tribes also have stories about them. So if you're looking for some spooky experiences without the crowds, I think this is definitely the place to be. Today's spooky park story is our first city park because I just found out that one of Chicago's most popular parks has thousands of unmarked graves beneath it. The Couch Memorial at the southern end of Lincoln Park is the last remnant of what used to be Chicago's city cemetery. From 1843 to 1859, this was the primary cemetery for the city of Chicago. Then, in the 1860s, concerns about water quality and people's desire to live near a lakefront park rather than a burial ground began its conversion to a city park. Supposedly, the bodies were disinterred and moved, or at least they were supposed to be. Only 10 men were working to remove the graves, and with tens of thousands of bodies there, it was a near impossible task. Then the Chicago fire swept through in 1871 and destroyed most of the wooden headstones. City officials just removed the rest. Official documents claim that all of the bodies were removed, but someone lied. Throughout the construction of Lincoln Park, dozens of graves have been uncovered, and historians estimate that 10,000 to 12,000 bodies still remain. Crater Lake has a spooky history that stretches to long before it was a national park. It includes everything from dragon-like monsters to UFO sightings, to missing persons cases, to ghosts, and last but not least, a floating log that potentially controls the weather. The Klamath and other area tribes believe that Crater Lake and the mountain that preceded it is the doorway to the below world. This makes sense considering they were witnesses to the largest explosive eruption in the Cascades in the past 1 million years. They believe that the lake is sacred and even that looking upon it may lead to death. Wizard Island is the center of many stories. Rangers tell tales of seeing campfires or smoke on the island long after the last tour boat has left, only to find that nothing is there when they arrive later to check it out. I was actually told some of these stories when I was doing field work there. Another ghostly fire was spotted outside the rim by a ranger on patrol. Ranger Kerwin claimed she saw a large fire surrounded by at least 10 people far from any designated campground. As soon as she approached to tell them off, the fire and all of the people had disappeared. Supposedly, it was on the site of an old Park Service campground called Cold Spring. The old man of the lake even gets in on the action. It's claimed he controls the weather. When a submarine crew was working in the lake in the late 1980s to survey the bottom, they tried tying him up so he wouldn't get in their way. Legend says that severe storms blew in that day, stirring up the water and preventing them from working. They stopped as soon as he was set free. Guess he just didn't want to be tied down. Hawaii's Big Island is home to Mauna Loa, the largest volcano on Earth. Native Hawaiians say it is also home to the volcano goddess Pele. People have lived on the island for over 1,500 years, and since 1916, it's where you can find Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Many people believe taking rocks or sand from the island will offend Pele and lead to misfortune. In fact, hundreds of people send or bring back rocks each year after experiencing a bout of terrible luck. It's hard to say where this myth originated. Oral traditions don't mention a curse. Some people think park rangers may have invented it just to scare people away from taking rocks. It's claimed that Pele sometimes takes a human form, appearing either as an old woman with a small white dog or as a tall, beautiful young woman. There have been sightings of a ghostly white dog at the Volcano House Hotel, and people think it may be associated with Pele. The lava lake at the summit of Kilauea formed again just a few weeks ago. I think it's spooky in its own way. No one knows how long this eruption will last, but at 127 acres, this lava lake is about 10 times larger than the one that existed from 2008 to 2018. As of October 11th, scientists estimated that over 4.2 billion gallons of lava had been erupted since the first fissure opened up on September 30th. At night, you can see a fiery glow coming from the caldera, a hellish portal that serves as a reminder of the vast natural power of our planet. Within the boundary of Cuyahoga Valley National Park lies the site of the abandoned mill town of Boston Village. Established in 1806, the town fell victim to an eminent domain claim to create the national park in 1974. The village was associated with Boston Mills and its once thriving paper mill, but in the years since has come to be known as Helltown, and there are some truly wild stories that have come out of it. Here are just a few of them. First, there's the Peninsula Python, a giant mutant snake that's thought to roam the woods. Stories of this and other mutated animals, and people, sprang up after it was discovered that the nearby Kraichi dump was contaminated with toxic chemicals. Restoration of the former dump wasn't finished until 2015, and people in the area still celebrate Python Day. Of course, no abandoned town would be complete without rumors of a group of murderous Satanists. In this case, those rumors are fueled by the presence of upside-down crosses on the Mother of Sorrows church, which are actually just part of its decorative trim. It's claimed, though, that these Satanists still wander the back roads, looking for new recruits or their next victim. Finally, there's Stanford Road, which is one of the main roads leading to Helltown. Many have taken to calling it the end of the world road. Beyond the ominous road closed sign is a twisty, dangerous drive, with steep inclines that can make it appear as if your car is about to drive off of a cliff. Or its name may come from the fact that it comes to a sudden stop. Either way, people say that the road itself is evil, and that it can take possession of people's vehicles, causing fatal accidents. The vacant buildings in Boston Village were completely demolished in 2016, and the multitude of strange tales associated with it have largely been debunked, but the town's spooky legacy still persists. It's my birthday, so I wanted to do one more spooky park video for this year. I chose one of my favorites, Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. For this story, we'll go to a lesser-known part of the park. Outside of the magnificent sand dunes on the mainland, the park also includes a set of two islands, North Manitou and South Manitou. They are located about 8 miles offshore and are only accessible by ferry in the summer months, although people did used to live there full-time before the park was established. The portion of the lake between the mainland and the islands is known as the Manitou Passage, and is the deadliest section of Lake Michigan. There are over 50 known shipwrecks. This includes the Francisco Morazan, which ran aground in November of 1960 during a snowstorm. It's still visible from the southwest shore of South Manitou Island. Those aboard the Francisco Morazan survived, but many others were not so lucky. On stormy nights, it's claimed you can hear the panicked and wailing cries of shipwreck victims from the shores of the island. South Manitou Island is home to several other ghost stories. There's said to be the ghost of a woman who walks the beach each night awaiting the return of her long-lost love. A former lighthouse keeper and his wife and child reportedly haunt the old island lighthouse. Their family drowned after their small boat capsized when they were on their way back from the mainland in 1878. There are also stories of park rangers stationed on the island hearing footsteps, voices, and slamming doors inside some of the historic buildings that are now used for park operations and housing. Apparently, one ranger grew so distraught by the activity in the house he was living in that he drew his weapon and demanded to be taken back to the mainland because the ghosts were tormenting him. So, between the shipwrecks just offshore and ghosts living on the island, you can see why South Manitou Island has been called the most haunted place in Michigan. And with that, spooky park stories will return again next fall.